Hello, this is Pastor Josh, and this is the view from my chair. It's a pretty quiet morning today, not a whole lot of activity out there. One of our staff members remarked that he was thankful this week for double-digit heat. We were finally out of the triple-digit heat, and yet it's still hot out there. But the more important view for today is the view into God's Word. We're looking at Hosea chapter 4 this week, and as we've discovered throughout Hosea, it is jam-packed with all sorts of great things to look at. This particular chapter in Hosea is introduced as the Lord has a case. It's the Hebrew word riv, the case against Israel. This is the language of a lawsuit or a court metaphor, and it would seem that the metaphor of marriage has receded into the background. The metaphor of marriage certainly dominates chapters 1 through 3, but keep in mind that in this particular context, the courtship ritual that was introduced in chapters 1 through 3 culminates not in a wedding ceremony like in our culture, but actually in a place, a home for the couple, bride and groom, to live. We saw that in Hosea chapter 2, verses 21 through 23. And with that in mind, it helps to make sense of the emphasis in chapter 4 on land. The land in which Israel lives is prominent. And so really what we have here is the Lord zooming in on the consequences of Israel's rebellion that show up in its broken relationship with the land and also with Him. The structure for this passage is relatively simple. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 3 serve as kind of an opening to the case that the Lord will bring. This is the case against the people or the inhabitants of the land. This particular section introduces not just chapter 4, but honestly, it introduces chapters 4 all the way through chapter 11. It doesn't just introduce these particular verses. But the case against the people is followed by the case against the priest. And God's attention is turned to the priest's failure to do their job, to teach the law of God that they have forgotten. And so God's condemnation comes against them. Following the case against the priest is the case against the people's worship. We see here in this section that the people's worship is faulty as well. They are consulting wooden idols. They are sacrificing on the mountaintops. These are, again, acts of promiscuity that we have seen before. Idolatry is depicted as unfaithfulness to Yahweh's marriage covenant. And then lastly, in the last section, 15 through 19, we see the case against Israel's influence. They are influencing Judah and leading them astray. And so the prophet Hosea warns Judah not to pilgrimage into the places of Gilgal or Beth Aven, which are in the region of Israel. And so this whole section opens up chapter 4 through 11, but in particular here it's verses 1 through 3 open up the Lord's case against the people of Israel. Interestingly, each one of these sections show a connection to Genesis, and in particular the Genesis account of creation. In verse 3, we see this with the description of the wild animals, the birds of the sky and the fish of the sea. They are suffering. They are a part of the land that is mourning because of the influence of sinful and rebellious Israel and also sinful and rebellious humanity. The three categories of animals, birds, and fish also show up in Psalm 8. but that is based on Genesis chapter 1. And so these three categories are part of God's good creation, and what we see here as the land is mourning and the animals languishing and even the fish of the sea disappearing. This is the undoing or the reversal of the creation order. It is possible that this particular Hebrew word translated mourning here is behind Paul's reference to all of creation groaning in Romans chapter 8, verses 19 through 22. The Greek word for groaning is also translated as mourning in Isaiah 19, verse 8, and then also 24, verse 7. So it may be that the Apostle Paul is reflecting back on this kind of thought, that because of the rebelliousness of humanity, all of creation is broken and is groaning or mourning because of it. But that connection with Genesis continues in the second section, in the condemnation or the case against the priests. Here we see it in verse 10, this Genesis connection. The priests have abandoned their devotion. That's the translation in the Christian Standard Bible. Now, you'll notice that other translations handle this differently. What's happening here is the Hebrew word translated abandon, their devotion to the Lord, is in Hebrew, it is the word shamar. It means to keep. That's what's happening with shamar. But in Hebrew, there's no object of the infinitive. So to keep is an infinitive. It should have an object. The to the Lord is added to try to make sense of that in English, because the sentence seems to leave it hanging or leave it opening. The Greek translators of the Septuagint connected shamar with promiscuity. So some English translations will pick that up by assuming that the sentence should continue in the end of chapter 10 into verse 11 to say they have kept or maintained or guarded promiscuity. However, the argument against that is there's no other instance in the Hebrew Old Testament in which shamar is followed by promiscuity. That's a construction that doesn't occur anywhere else. But it does occur often in connection with the word forsake. Forsake shows up in Jeremiah chapter 16, verse 11, with the instruction of the Lord as its object. And so likely what's happening here is the priests have failed to keep the instruction or keep, the word of the Lord. Why would that be a connection to Genesis chapter 1 and 2? Well, in Genesis 2:15, Adam is commanded to keep or maintain or protect the garden as part of his responsibility. His failure to keep the law of God by protecting Eve from the incursion of the devil is akin to the priest's failure to keep the law of the Lord. They have forgotten the law of the Lord. And so Adam, as priest of the garden, fails in his job, and the priest fail because they have forgotten the law of God. And so both of them come under judgment. They are accused in this case, and the priests are shown to be like Adam. But the connections with Genesis continue with the references to creation, the mountaintops, and the different kinds of trees. Trees were associated in the pagan world with goddesses and fertility. The mountaintops were associated with the place where the divine and human would meet. And so what we see here is that the creation in Genesis chapter 1 and 2 is supposed to be the gift of God to humanity, But when humanity rebels against God, creation becomes the object of worship instead of that which is to be kept and to be stewarded. In the last little section, Hosea chapter 4, 15 through 19, we don't see a reference to Genesis chapter 1 and 2, but rather to Genesis 32. This is the story in which Jacob wrestles with God, and his name is changed to Israel. That's where the name comes from. There's a play on words in Hebrew that shows up in verse 16 right here that plays off of the origin of Jacob's name when it was changed to Israel. In Genesis 32, where Jacob wrestles with God, Genesis 32 verse 28, Jacob struggles with God or strives with God. The Hebrew word for struggle or strive is sarah. That is a tenacious striving. Jacob won't let go of God until God blesses him. But here in Hosea 4:16, Israel is a obstinate, stubborn cow. In Hebrew, both of those words, obstinate and stubborn, come from a very similar word to sarah. It is sarar. This is a poetic way of saying that instead of striving with God, working hard to stay close to him, Israel has become like a sarar, a stubborn cow, and won't follow God even into the open meadow. It's a poetic way of describing their failure to be like their father Jacob, who would go so far as to wrestle with the angel of the Lord, not let him go until he blessed them. And now the people of Israel refuse to go with God. They won't follow him, even though he's leading them into open meadows and into blessing. So there's much to explore in Hosea chapter 4, lots of great connections to the Old Testament, and lots of places for us to reflect on the case that God may bring against us, especially with respect to being teachers of the law of God. So let us not be stubborn like cows, refusing to follow him, but instead let us be like Jacob, refusing to let go of him, knowing his word and sharing it with others. And may God bless you as you do both of those things.